Welcome. I'm Sharon Bradford Franklin, Senior Counsel with the Constitution Project, and I want to thank you for joining us here today for our briefing, The False Choice, Cybersecurity versus Civil Liberties. The Constitution Project, for those of you not familiar with our organization, is a constitutional watchdog based here in Washington, D.C., and we pull people together from across the political spectrum and work with them to promote constitutional safeguards. And we're very pleased to partner here today with both the ACLU and the Center for Democracy and Technology in sponsoring today's briefing. Now, as all of you are well aware, every day now we have new news stories about the growing cyber threat and the need for Congress to act quickly to safeguard our nation. FBI Director Robert Mueller has been testifying and speaking out, saying that cyber threats are going to overtake terrorism in the very near future as the greatest threat to our country. And just yesterday, there was an op-ed in the Washington Post by John Brennan, Senior Counterterrorism Advisor to President Obama, urging Congress to pass the Cybersecurity Act, the version that's now pending in the Senate. But it is also critically important that Congress act very carefully as it approaches these issues to make sure that you are focusing on all the relevant concerns as you address the bills pending before you. As you know, the House is expected to consider cybersecurity legislation very soon. We're told that next week has been dubbed Cybersecurity Week, and at least CISPA, the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act, or H.R. 3523, is likely to come to the House floor. I want to flag, there are a variety of bills, as I'm sure you're aware, that have been introduced in the House on cybersecurity. I want to flag two others that are maybe more for your focus and may come up in our conversation here today. One is H.R. 3674, the Precise Act, sponsored by Representative Lundgren, and the other is H.R. 4263, the Secure IT Act, sponsored by Representatives Bono, Mack, and Blackburn as a companion bill to one of the bills now pending in the Senate. Now, as the title of our briefing here today makes clear, our focus is on the civil liberties issues along with national security issues raised by cybersecurity legislation. Of course, there are other issues that you and your bosses will need to consider as you focus on this legislation, but they are involving the scope of business regulation, for example, but those are beyond the scope of our conversation here today. For the Constitution Project, our involvement in this issue came up through our Liberty and Security Committee, which is a bipartisan committee formed in the aftermath of September 11th to ensure that we promote both our national security and our civil liberties. And just this past January, that committee released its report, recommendations for the implementation of a comprehensive and constitutional cybersecurity policy. And I hope you picked up a copy of that report on your way in today, along with other materials from ACLU and CDT. The report is part of our committee's ongoing work to make sure that we continue to apply Fourth Amendment safeguards in the digital age. And overall, our focus is on, therefore, when the government gets access to your private electronic communications through cybersecurity, which is something that the legislation would enable. Overall, we made three categories of recommendations in that report, and I just want to highlight them very briefly for you. First, that there be rigorous oversight of any cybersecurity program. Second, that there be robust privacy safeguards included. And third, that there be strict limits on the government's access to and use of this cybersecurity information that is coming in. Within our panel, one of our committee members on that report, Judge Robertson here, is here today to address the report and its application to the bills before you. We also were slated to have a second committee member joining us here today, Mary McCarthy. Unfortunately, she contacted me this morning with a family medical emergency and sends her regrets that she could not participate. But I can tell you, she is a career intelligence official serving in high positions in, among other agencies, the CIA, and she too would join in urging you that Congress can safeguard both our civil liberties and our national security with this legislation. And of course, we have panelists here today, I'll introduce everybody in a moment, from the ACLU and CDT, who will also address these civil liberties issues raised by the bills. So before I introduce the panelists and turn this conversation over to them, I just want to give you a brief moment on what the state of play is right now with cybersecurity. So right now, the federal government monitors its own networks. In the civilian world, it's through a program called Einstein that's centered at the Department of Homeland Security, and that monitors all of the .gov environment. We also have private companies, of course, monitoring their own networks. And what the legislation is looking to do is to set up more public-private partnerships. Right now, we have one pilot program in existence that was started by the Department of Defense and then turned over to the Department of Homeland Security, and that works with Defense Industrial Base, or DIB companies. And that pilot program was the first one where we tested with the government sending out cyber threat information to those DIB companies, and the DIB companies in turn sharing information back to the federal government. And most of the bills before you that you'll be looking at do try and model it on this type of an information sharing approach. And from a civil liberties perspective, as you will hear the panelists discuss, the civil liberties concerns come up with the information pathway from the private companies back to the federal government. That's where that raises concerns about the government's access to individuals' private communications. So we have an expert panel here to discuss these issues in more detail. After I introduce each of them, they will make some opening remarks. Then I'll ask some questions of the panelists and then open it up for your questions from the audience. And I'm not going to give lengthy bios. You hopefully picked up the program here today, which gives all of the illustrious resumes of our panelists. But I just want to briefly introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. We're going to start with Judge James Robertson, who is a former judge serving on the U.S. District Court here in the District of Columbia. He also, importantly, is a former judge from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, or the FISA Court. So it gives him a great deal of experience in dealing with classified information and the kinds of threats to our country that are relevant to speak to the ability to protect both national security and civil liberties. Our other two panelists are both of our subject matter experts who have really been living with the cybersecurity bills for quite a while now and are very steeped in all the nuances raised there. Next speaker will be Michelle Richardson, who is Legislative Counsel with the American Civil Liberties Union's Washington Legislative Office. And our final speaker will be Greg Nojon, who is Director of the Project on Freedom, Security, and Technology at CBT. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Judge Robertson.
Thank you. Is my microphone on? Yes, it is. Thank you, Sharon. Indulge me for a moment, if you will. I'm trying to think about what I can sensibly say to this group this morning. I've been wool-gathering a little bit about privacy and about the erosion of privacy in my lifetime. And it's a lot shorter than my lifetime since we began to be horrified by things. I don't know if any of you remember Admiral Poindexter and the DARPA program called Total Information Awareness. Total Information Awareness was about 10 years ago. It was a Defense Department idea. They were going to basically collect all the information in the world and from it find out who was doing what to whom. This was politically unwise, and it crashed and burned. But DARPA is still at work on something like it. It's sometimes generically called data mining. Then there was the FBI and Carnivore. Who remembers Carnivore? Carnivore is an FBI program that was going to do the same thing. Now, that probably goes down in history as one of the worst named programs in the world. If you're going to name something Carnivore and give it to the FBI, you're in trouble from the get-go. It's like when General Motors figured out they couldn't sell cars in Mexico called Nova because Nova in Spanish means doesn't go. Now we have Einstein. Einstein is a perfectly acceptable name. I mean, Einstein, and it's DHS, so it's not the Defense Department. Einstein is great. I mean, he was smart, wasn't he? And his thinking led us to the atomic bomb. Let's not forget that. But I'm looking out here and at this audience of what I think is the Facebook generation, and I'm wondering whether the instinct for privacy is still alive in the American public. I think it is. I hope it is. But what I'm here about today is preserving the instinct of, trying to preserve the instinct of privacy and make sure that we don't wave it away without thinking about it in this legislation. Now, the Constitution Project's report that Sharon mentioned, I hope you will take a copy of it and try to read it. I say try to read it because, frankly, it's a little boring. It's boring because it is written reasonably by a bipartisan group of people who are trying to do the right thing, and nobody is making any rhetorical flourishes in it. It's carefully done, thoughtfully done, and is really worth your time. My assignment really focuses on just a couple of paragraphs of this report, which you can find at page 21. And it deals with H.R. 3523. And it begins with the House Republican Cybersecurity Task Force, the House Republican Cybersecurity Task Force, which last October issued regulations for cybersecurity legislation. That report states that any information shared with the federal government should have, quote, sensitive, personally identifiable information from Americans removed and sanitized before it is shared. PII is the acronym for personally identifiable information. We'll probably all be using the initials PII here today. The Constitution Project agrees that the sanitization and anonymization, I hate that word, of PII is an essential part of any proposed cybersecurity initiative. The Rogers Bill, H.R. 3523, does not include a provision that protects PII. There's nothing in it that says that PII should be sanitized, or that information should be sanitized, or that information should be anonymized before it is turned over to the government. And that is point one, and maybe the most important point that I'm here to urge be done today. In the Lundgren Bill 3674, H.R. 3674, there is a provision, I think it's section 242(1)A of the Lundgren Bill, which I commend to you, which ought to be incorporated in some version in any bill that gets out of the House, which basically says information that is to be shared with the government must be anonymized or sanitized to remove personally identifiable information. Now, I will leave it to the techies to decide exactly how that is done. And I will tell you from my experience with the FISA court that the anonymize, sanitize, minimize are all the buzzwords that are used to clean up or otherwise obscure information, personally identifiable information. The sorry truth is that, and as I think we all know, nothing that ever gets committed to electrons ever gets really lost. So sanitized, minimized, anonymized are words that shouldn't be just thrown into the statute without some definition and without some staff work to figure out what exactly that means. Or at least regulations need to be adopted. But suffice it to say that the statute, whatever is enacted here, needs to contain something about sanitization or minimization or anonymization of PII. Use restriction. H.R. 3523 allows broad sharing of information from the private sector to the government when at least one purpose is, when it's a significant purpose. Let me get the language correct. The federal government may use cyber threat information shared with the federal government in accordance with subsection B for any lawful purpose only if the use of such information is not for a regulatory purpose, okay. And at least one significant purpose of the use of such information is a cybersecurity purpose for the protection of the national security of the United States. At least one significant purpose is a cybersecurity purpose for the protection of the United States. The cybersecurity purpose is a defined term which I won't bore you with reading it, but it's in the statute. Fair warning. And this is from my FISA court experience and from the amendment of the FISA Act by the Patriot Act. The FISA court originally, the FISA, the FISA Act originally provided that a purpose for which a warrant could be issued had to be a national security purpose. And it was amended in the Patriot Act to require only a significant purpose. And that little amendment requiring only a significant purpose to be national security opened up a hole in the FISA Act big enough to drive a truck through. Because it meant that any prosecutor could, if he or she was really searching just for routine criminal information, resort to the FISA Act, and it's easy to find a national security purpose. Easy to find a national security purpose. It would be even easier to find at least one cybersecurity purpose or a national security purpose for sharing information from the private sector to the government. And that is a loophole that could, I don't want to create imaginary horribles here, but that at least one purpose language could result in the use, in the freedom of the government to use all kinds of information, especially if it's not sanitized, anonymized, or minimized with PII. The government will then have everything, and your privacy and mine will be history. My pitch, for what it's worth, is number one, let's inject something about sanitization in the PII aspect of this bill. And number two, let's take out that provision that says at least one purpose and make it the purpose has to be national security or cyber or cyber purposes. Otherwise, it can't be shared with the government. I'm done.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thanks, Sharon. Whereas the judge talked about what information ideally could be protected under the scheme and what could be shared and protect civil liberties at the same time, the other question you will be deciding is who the information can be shared with. And it's absolutely critical that when you vote on CISPA, you insist that American civilian domestic internet information only be given directly to a civilian agency. And we are very concerned that right now, as written, CISPA would allow the direct collection of all this very sensitive and very private information by NSA and other components of the Department of Defense. And I should say that my comments on this point are applicable to the draft that was put on the website as recently as yesterday. This is a problem that has continued through the bill, has introduced the markup and the discussion drafts that are now on the HITC website. It's an American value that the military does not operate on American soil against Americans. And allowing the NSA to now actively collect information about Americans' internet use history, the content of their communications, and other sensitive records about their computer use There'd be an absolute turn of the Fourth Amendment and our privacy notions on their head. It would also be a step back from where we are. We do have to give props to the Obama administration for making significant steps over the last several years for making sure that the programs that they are currently running are all cabined into DHS. And writing a bill that would allow this to be shifted back into NSA would be a substantial step backwards. And even if, let's say, Obama were not to authorize or to take that option right now, that doesn't mean that a future administration wouldn't take that step. Or perhaps after an emergency situation or a catastrophic event, things might change and things would be shifted over to NSA or DOD. And that's why it's absolutely critical that you, as Congress, make that policy decision, which is absolutely critical, and write it into the statute and clarify that DHS or some other civilian agency be the recipient of this very sensitive information. Now, there has been some debate about whether that would be workable. It's very important to point out that the Obama administration's proposal from May of last year would have clearly put this in DHS's hands. Not, different choices, you could go to different agencies or different centers or different clearinghouses. It would have directed all information through DHS. And that decision was a result of a very lengthy interagency process that had the sign-off of the NSA and the DOD and the entire U.S. intelligence community. So the idea that that's unworkable is belied by the fact that the actual folks right now in the military say that they could make that work if that were how it were created. DHS Secretary Napolitano testified before the Homeland Security Committee a couple of months ago that their position is that they absolutely believe that these programs should be kept civilian. That's also shown through their actions. For example, as Sharon mentioned, the Defense Industrial Base Pilot Program was created originally in the National Security Agency, and that was moved over to DHS. They issued a privacy impact assessment in January that actually has some pretty decent language that says, once DHS gets this information, if it doesn't directly pertain to the cyber threat, it is destroyed, period. Now we're going to hold on to it for 5 years, the data mine it, put it in a database, store it in the NSA's Utah facility, but that there are some meaningful protections on it. And if that can work with the Defense Industrial Base, where there's the strongest argument that the NSA and the DOD should be directly involved, it certainly would work for the public, open internet, where you're talking about everyday American citizens who are just emailing their loved ones and accessing their bank accounts and reading information. And then, finally, there is a memorandum between DHS and NSA that clarifies that NSA should not be operating on the open public internet and that this should be led by DHS. And none of this precludes DHS from relying on NSA for their expertise. This doesn't mean that you would have to create a whole new NSA and DHS. They could rely on their many analysts and computing power, but they, as a civilian agency, would be tasked with protecting this American information. And we do really appreciate that you have folks in the Obama administration, even in their military arm, like Aaron Rosenbach, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber Policy in the Department of Defense, saying, absolutely not, we should not be in charge of this. This needs to go through a civilian agency. Specifically on CISPA, the bill would still very clearly allow companies to choose which agency to share this very sensitive information with. It's completely up to them, and they could go to DHS, but they could also go to NSA or somewhere else in DOD. The language that was inserted in the discussion draft just says that if you go to someone else besides DHS, that DHS will also have to be notified. So you could give internet use history or the content of communications to the NSA. It's just that the DHS will be CC'd. That does not fix the privacy problem here. This does not fix the problem of the military operating on U.S. soil and collecting information on Americans' internet use history. So you could fix this. You could either go in and do something more explicit, like what was in the Lundgren bill as introduced, or in the Obama's administration proposal from last year, to actually designate an office in DHS to receive this information. Or for maximum flexibility, you could just go in and just say that the information has to go to a civilian agency, and then allow the administration to later designate who that would be, or multiple offices for different types of information. But you would just clarify that it should not be going directly to the NSA and DoD.
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks to the Constitution Project for making this all possible. My name is Greg, and thank you for coming out on a nice day during the lunch hour. My name is Greg Oden. I'm with the Center for Democracy and Technology. CDT is a nonprofit organization here in Washington. We're dedicated to keeping the internet open, innovative, and free. And we see the Rogers Bill, which I will call CISPA, as a threat to those goals with respect to the internet. I'm going to outline what I think are the 4 biggest problems in CISPA and invite discussion afterwards about those problems. The first one is that the bill has an overly broad description of the data that can be shared with the government. This is probably the most important issue in cybersecurity. Everyone agrees that more information sharing between the government and the private sector, and within the private sector itself, would probably help for cybersecurity reasons. What we're talking about, when we talk about information sharing, we're talking about personal communications, and we're talking about information about those communications. So it's very sensitive. It's, for that reason, protected by strong criminal statutes, the Wiretap Act, ACTA, and other laws. So the way CISPA works is that it preempts all of those laws. It says, even if one of these privacy statutes says you can't share this information, you can. If we're going to preempt all law to permit the sharing of cybersecurity information, we've got to narrowly define that information, and then we've got to put in the protections that are necessary to ensure that the information is used for cybersecurity reasons. And that's where the bill, I think, falls short in a significant way. Its description is very general. It has improved in the latest draft, but it's still overly general in terms of what it permits to be shared. The good news on that score is that there are very good alternatives to the language that's in the CISPA bill right now. The Lundgren bill, as marked up by subcommittee, has a very good description of the information that can be shared. It lays it out in 6 categories. And they really are kind of cyber attack information. An IT guy would say, this is what I really need to see that other people are seeing. And this is what I'd really like to share so that other people can know what I saw on my network. The Lieberman bill in the Senate also has a very good description of the information that can be shared. We have urged a significant tweak, it's just a couple words, to the Lieberman bill's description of that information. And by the way, I didn't have time to print documents to bring them here, but we did a very good chart that compares all the leading cybersecurity bills. It's up on our website. When you go to cdt.org, www.cdt.org, you will see a banner about CISPA. Click on it, and then you go in there and you'll be able to find a nice chart that compares all the leading bills on civil liberties grounds. Another significant problem with CISPA is the lack of any meaningful use restriction on recipients of the cyber threat information. That's what Judge Robertson was talking about. All you have to do is overcome a little speed bump. You have to come up with a cybersecurity or a national security use of the threat information that's shared. And once you get over that little bump, and as Judge Robertson said, it's easy to do that. Once you're over it, the government can use the information that was shared with it for cybersecurity reasons. It can use it for any non-regulatory purpose. That's quite broad. That means that it could be used to prosecute a crime, could be used to prosecute any crime, and could be used for any other reason. This too is very troubling to us, and I must add that it's not a reasonable protection to say that the cybersecurity information can be used at the outset for a national security purpose. National security is very broad, very broad, very broad. And it's very easy to imagine a national security use for any little dot when you're in the business of connecting the dots. And that's what this data will be treated as. The third problem is the one that Michelle talked about. It's the flow of private communications information from the private sector to the National Security Agency. I think it's, in our view, the train has left the station on who should have primary responsibility for cybersecurity and dealings with the private sector. It is the non-defense contractor part of the private sector. And that is that DHS has been given that role, has assumed that role, and is starting to do a much better job in running with that role. Once information flows to NSA, it's usefully secret. Nobody will know how it's being used, and nobody will know for how long it's stored, and there will be no public accountability. DHS has operated differently to its credit. If you look at a DHS privacy impact assessment, you will see they are the best in government. You will not see many, if any, privacy impact assessments about NSA programs. So transparency is a big problem, and the flow of information to the NSA will diminish transparency. That's bad for civil liberties. It's also bad for cybersecurity, because all of the bills operate voluntarily. A company can say, we're not sharing anything. They can say, we're not sharing anything. If they don't know how information will be used, because the use restrictions are so vague, and they do know the information can go to NSA, that puts them in a tight spot, because they will hesitate to share unless they are confident that the restrictions that they have put on the information that they share will be honored. And when there isn't transparency, it's hard to see how that actually works out. The fourth thing that I wanted to mention that is a problem in the CISPA bill is one that we did not focus on initially, but did focus on when we did our deep dive on the Senate legislation. And that's this very vague language about giving permission to, notwithstanding any other provision of law, quote, use cybersecurity systems to identify and obtain cyber threat information to protect the rights and property of either a self-protected entity or a cybersecurity provider. Use cybersecurity systems. I see some people are frowning because they don't know what that means. I am one of those people. It's hard to understand what that language is trying to accomplish, particularly when you look at what current law already permits. Current law permits any company that operates a network, i.e. any company in these days, to intercept, use, and disclose wired and electronic communications when doing that is a necessary incident to protecting its rights and property. They can hire agents to intercept, use, and disclose information to protect their rights and property. So it's not clear at all what this language is trying to accomplish. But the fact that it preempts all laws in accomplishing this vague purpose is very troubling to us. And we're trying to get that language fixed or struck. By the way, CDT has offered alternatives to deal with all of the problems that I identified just now. We have furnished them to committee staff. We have offered alternatives to our alternatives and furnished them to committee staff. And we're talking to the Rogers people a lot and hoping to get some significant changes. But so far, I have to say, the most significant privacy problems with the bill are the same as they were when the bill was introduced, the same as they are after the subcommittee markup, and the same as they would be even under the draft manager's amendment that was posted to the website recently. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. So before I open up to audience questions, I'm going to take moderator's privilege here. I'm going to ask the panelists a few questions, and then I will take your questions as well. So I'm going to start with Judge Robertson. Judge, you spoke a lot about the use restrictions that are in CISPA and how they're not adequate. One of the questions that comes up is, in people defending that, well, the government gets the information to be able to use it, is what about law enforcement use and what would be appropriate? And the Constitutional Project report does address this, and I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I must confess I got off the TCP message a little bit with that one.
Okay.
With my insistence on only one purpose, because the TCP is nonpartisan. And it's hard to resist the idea that you could that law enforcement that information from the private sector to law enforcement couldn't be used if, for example, it uncovered child pornography. And that's the example everybody thinks of when they think of a use that would be appropriate of information like this if it wound up in the hands of the government. The problem, of course, is, and the Constitution Project's take on that is, okay, if there's probable cause to establish that there is a crime being committed or that this is evidence of a crime, it can be used. The problem, of course, is who determines what's probable cause and how is it determined. And the Constitution Project doesn't really answer that question, and it's kind of left to the development of the law or regulations or good faith or whatever else. But I, as a loyal member of the Constitution Project, stand by that compromise solution that yes, if there is probable cause that a crime is being committed or that this is evidence of a crime, yes, it can be used with government. I just don't quite know what the mechanics of it are. It needs to be worked out.
Just to follow on that, the committee did not say it would have to go to a judge for judicial review, so it is open to being an administrative determination made by the executive branch. Michelle, I wanted to ask you, one of the items in the packet that ACLU has available for everyone to pick up is a letter coming from members of the open government community talking about problems that CISPA raises with regard to broad FOIA exceptions. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little on that.
Yes, about 40 organizations have come out against CISPA because one of the provisions says that all of the information given to the government will be exempt from FOIA and other local and state level Freedom of Information laws categorically, so blanket exemption. And the groups are concerned that this will be a way to cabin away and hide information that might otherwise be discoverable. And it's not so much the concern about maybe, let's say, the private communications or internet records or things like that that may be turned over, But to the extent that the bill also regulates, let's say, utility companies that, could have accidents in communities that could actually affect people that they have a right to know about, it is going to be over-inclusive, and so you don't want an incredibly broad, one fell swoop to prevent people from getting information. And there is contact information in that letter for open government folks who can answer more questions like that.
Thank you. Greg, I want to ask you, there are some folks out there in the advocacy community calling grassroots folks to oppose CISPA, drawing analogies to SOPA, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the uprising over that issue. And could you address in what ways that's a legitimate comparison, in what ways it's not, and what distinctions should be made?
CISPA is not SOPA. One, the problems, I guess the commonality is that there are procedural commonalities in terms of whether there was adequate consideration before the bills moved forward. Certainly, for CISPA, the bill was circulated in draft form to a number of organizations, including ours, and there were private discussions of them. Usually, honestly, when the intelligence people circulate a bill in draft form, they take it back at the end of the meeting, so you don't really get a good chance to go through the legislation and think it all the way through. But anyway, drafts were circulated. But that bill was introduced one day. It was marked up the next, and the markup was secret. That's not a good way to legislate on legislation that's going to affect internet users, as this one will. And there were similar procedural problems with the way that CISPA came up. But CISPA was about protecting intellectual property, and it had implications for free speech. SOPA is about protecting intellectual property, had implications for free speech. CISPA is about cybersecurity, and its primary civil liberties implications are the Fourth Amendment, the right to privacy as it's articulated in the Constitution.
Okay, I want to open this up for your questions. I would ask you two things. One, if you could please identify yourself and hopefully your office, and also if you could please actually ask the question.
On behalf of the Judiciary Committee, and I think that last point kind of begs the question, because if you've got authorization to collect data, and it's for not the purpose or the primary purpose, don't you have to wonder what the primary or the purpose is if it's not for cyber security? Because that's what seems to be left open. If I'm not willing to say it's the purpose or the primary purpose at least, then it could be anything, and I'm just using hey, I got something I can use this for. It seems to me in that same context that if I've authorized, which is you always say is a legitimate purpose, with the proper foundations and context, if I've authorized you to collect data for cybersecurity, and in the process you come upon evidence of child abuse, then I'm not as disturbed about your then being able to ensure that that information is properly handled by turning it over to law authorities. But aren't you leaving me in the position of wondering if that wasn't really your purpose, or going after copyright protections or something in the first place if I don't have to tell you my primary purpose is cybersecurity?
So this kind of harks back to the discussion about significant purpose tests during the Patriot Act debates about 10 years ago. And I think that Bobby Vassar from Mr. Scott's office is onto something. The companies, when they share, will be sharing for cybersecurity purposes. But the government, when it receives, can use for any purpose. that doesn't mean that the government, when it wants information, can't ask for it for a non-cyber reason. And in particular, the bill would permit the government to use the information for any purpose whatsoever, provided it also used it for a national security or a cybersecurity purpose. And as I said, that's a little tiny speed bump. There will always be a national security or a cybersecurity purpose to which this information can be used, to which this information can be put. So I think it does create this problem. And I have to add, if I could, companies, I think, need to focus a little bit more on how this is actually going to work in practice. The reality is a lot of large providers have a lot of contracts with the government that are very valuable to them. And when the government comes to call them with its bag of goodies, with its sticks and carrots, and says, we would like you to share this information for cybersecurity reasons, it will be hard for companies to say no. Today, a company can say, oh, you want to the NSA, comes and says, put this black box on your network to divert communications to us. Today, a company can say, no, Wiretap Act, no, Act. If this bill passes, they won't be able to say that, because this bill permits them to share voluntarily, notwithstanding those laws. That's a problem.
And can I just quickly follow up on that? Because if you look at the Patriot Act and the other expansions of post-9/11 authorities, and what the government has argued is relevant to advancing national security, it's incredibly broad. And you can look at the testimony of Valerie Caproni, the former general counsel of the FBI, for example, in 2007, 2008, and the controversy around national security letters. And she testified, I think before your committee even, that they routinely collect information on people who aren't suspected of doing anything wrong, because ruling people out is just as important as ruling people in. And they will keep it indefinitely because it may be useful in the future. And if that is now expanded beyond the criminal that you have in ECFA and the foreign intelligence FISA to create this new third column of collection of cybersecurity, it's going to be a windfall of new information. And that leads me to my second point. You hear some of the supporters of this bill talk as though there's no other way for the government to get information. That it's so out of date and we haven't addressed this. The government has rewritten surveillance laws a dozen times in the last decade, constantly expanding the government's power. You know, you had the Patriot Act, the Homeland Security Act, the Intel reform, the Patriot again, then you get on FISA, the Attorney General guidelines, the FBI guidelines, Executive Order 12333. We have gone through this so many times. The government's intelligence and collection authorities have been vetted and rewritten and redone so many times. It's actually crazy to think that this is, you know, some way that there's going to be information that there's no other way to get it, you know. And all of those rules and all of these rewrites have always made it easier to get the information, you know, without warrants, without probable cause, without high-level oversight. So the chance that there's going to be information there's no way else to get or use is almost impossible.
I'm just going to pile on here. This is so central to what we're talking about. I just want to add on one more piece here. So the whole purpose of this program is going to bring in a lot of information to the federal government is cybersecurity. So we want to make sure that it is really for that purpose and not for some other purpose. And there are various ways to narrow it. One is what Greg focused on, with narrowing the definition of what can be turned over in the first place. And another is limiting what the government can do once it gets its hands on it. We want to make sure if they legitimately are looking at something, your email, because your computer was hacked, and the alert goes off, but then they say, looks like he's up to something fishy with his finances. Let's see what the IRS thinks. Maybe he's up to tax fraud. Okay, that's not supposed to be the purpose of this program, to just anything that looks a little fishy to turn over to some other arm of the federal government. It's supposed to be a cybersecurity purpose, and we want those limits. Now, our committee did make the one caveat exemption that Jefferson talked about for law enforcement. If you really have probable cause of another crime, we don't want to tie the government's hands in that situation. But beyond that, it should be cybersecurity. That's the whole point of the program. That's what it should be limited to. So, I think we had...
Yes, I was just wondering, I mean, is this implying that any private information is just ready to be harvested at the moment? I mean, considering most private information is already on the internet, wouldn't it just be ready to be harvested? What are the...
it's not harvested, it's voluntary sharing by the companies.
None of what we're concerned about is public on the internet. If it's public on the internet, it can be harvested without this new law. What we're talking about is communication from me and that communication back, or my communication to a website where I'm accessing information from the website. That's all private. That's all protected right now. And what the bill does is say those protections are going to go away for cyber. And so that's what we're worried about.
I'm Dan from Congressman Michaud's office. This question's for Michelle, because I think you touched on this point. What is, under CISPA, what is the role of the NSA compared to other federal agencies like DHS or Department of Ag or Treasury? Specifically, like are there more powers enumerated, or I guess I'm just asking how NSA fits into the mix.
So it's not specifically mentioned. The original recipient of the information is not designated at all in the bill, and the companies would have the choice of which agency they would want to go to. So it could be NSA, it could be DHS, it could be an agency that maybe directly regulates them because they're a utility or some other entity that has something specific to do with an office. The only direct mention now under the draft that's put on the HC site is the mention of the NCIC, who sort of get CC'd on the information. So the NSA is not explicitly designated as the recipient. It's all left up to the companies to decide who will collect our personal information. It's absolutely inappropriate for the companies to be making that decision. It's a decision for Congress to make, just like they did in PEPFA, just like they did in FISA, just like it's worked for 40 years under all of our privacy laws. There needs to be a clear designation of who receives the information and what they can be done with it, exactly how you get it. You don't just let every company just decide willy-nilly where the information goes and what it's going to look like.
I just want to clarify one point on that. The information sharing programs are two ways. So when the government is sharing information out to private companies on what the threats are, if the NSA has that information and wants to share that, that doesn't raise our civil liberties concerns, right? Okay. So the concern is that the information coming back into the federal government should go to a civilian agency. Okay. Other questions? Yes, back there.
Hi, it's Caitlin from Congressman McGovern's office. Is there any incentive for companies to share, or what is the incentive for companies to share? And do you have an estimate of, what the round will look like? How many companies will participate?
So it's hard to know today how much is going to be shared. Could be a trickle, could be a stream, could be a river, and it could be an ocean. What companies get out of it is the share back. And the bill says you can't condition the share back on the share. So I think that what companies get out of it, it kind of involves some altruism. If I share and make a better information sharing system that allows me to get back threat information that I can use to protect my network, I might share a little more. But there isn't a compulsion. That is a very good thing for civil liberties. You wouldn't want companies to be compelled to turn over information. Then they would turn over more than they had to out of fear of running afoul of the compulsion. So voluntary is good. Voluntary is what the bill does. I think that there is a reporting requirement, right, that will allow Congress to return to it to see, did this work? Are the companies playing the way we thought they would? Did it go overboard? Are they sharing too much? I think that's a good thing. But incentive, again, it really turns around the notion that if everybody plays, or a number of us play, we'll get back information that will be useful to protect our networks.
The other incentive, of course, is there are liability limitations on the companies to exempt them from lawsuits if they do engage in that sharing. And the system bill right now has a willfulness standard there. So.
Speaking of incentives, though, there is a provision in the, I don't know if it's actually in the bill yet or just proposed for the bill, but it reads, an entity sharing cyber threat information that is provided to the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center of Homeland Security may request the head of such center, and the head of such center may provide such information to another department or agency of the federal government. Now, what's that all about? Well, I can tell you from my FISA experience that there is this business of providing information to the government when it asks for it is not a cost-free proposition. It costs providers money to set themselves up to provide information to the government. And one incentive may be, hell, give it to everybody. If I give it to you, I want to make sure nobody else asks for it, so you've got my carte blanche just to pass this information around freely to everybody. That's bad news also.
It's in the back there.
So Ryan, Congressman Walton's office. Sort of following up from the last question, is there anything in the bill that would require a company to disclose to its customers when it shares information either before or after the fact?
Not in CISPA, not in Lieberman, not in Lundgren, not in McCain. Nope.
So you were talking about how the labor bill spells out exactly what that information can be shared. It's my understanding that that part of the bill has been taken out, and it's going to be like we're on a piece of it that looks like the accessibilities and critical infrastructure protection. So I guess how does that influence sort of the stage play of the different pieces of legislation on the table?
The question is, isn't the language that I identified as being good language in the Lundgren bill coming out? And the answer is that a manager's amendment was posted to the Homeland Security Committee's website last night, or yesterday, that would substitute for that language some of the language that is in CISPA, causing us to dub the Lundgren bill manager's amendment son of CISPA. It looks a lot like that the proposal from the Intelligence Committee. And we have asked that they just not even take a position on what information would be shared, what the use restriction would be, to leave that to the people at the Intelligence Committee. And the reason that makes sense is because the Intelligence Committee's bill is still evolving. And by taking a piece of that still evolving thing and putting it into the Homeland Security Committee's bill, you force a vote on something that you know is going to change. And so the only people who would be voting on it would be people who never even came up with it in the first place. And they get kind of stuck with that vote and that language. So what makes sense to me at this point for Homeland is to say, all right, we're not going to force a vote on this issue. This is going to get resolved at the Intelligence Committee level. But right now, again, the manager's amendment would lift language from CISPA and put it into the Lundgren bill in a way that's very bad for civil liberties. And we are urging a no vote on that amendment.
Any other questions? Yes.
You say that in CISPA, the information sharing is voluntary and the company can share as much information or as little information they want. Is that consistent throughout all the bills, or is it just that one bill?
In all bills, information sharing is voluntary. What's inconsistent is what you can share. And CISPA is the one that allows for the broad share.
Hi, my name is Catherine Helm, Break Forbes. In terms of the companies or industries that would be most impacted by this, would it be kind of the internet service providers? Do you expect that they'd be doing most of the information sharing, or is this really going to be a general in terms of who it affects?
Yes, we believe that's the main target, and that's what's generally meant, in lay terms, by cybersecurity. However, the bill, instead of drafted as saying this is an exception to ECPA and FISA to get electronic communications data, it says notwithstanding any provision of law, which means it's an exception to HIPAA and educational record laws and census data, tax records, gun laws. It's basically an exception to every privacy law ever written. This has been brought to the attention of the authors of all the bills, and so they are aware, and it's an intentional decision that maybe someday maybe some of that information will be stolen, and since they can't anticipate what the targets of cyber attacks will be in the future, they're just going to, in one fell swoop, create an exception to all of them. So, well, I think the ISPs are going to be the biggies. The implications are far broader, and I think most members who will be voting on this week, on our next week, if we're voting on this next week, don't realize that they're also implicating all of those other laws that aren't, directly on point.
If I could just add one thing to that. Oftentimes you'll see examples about information sharing that the company that operates this part of the electric grid wants to share with that company that operates this part of the electric grid, and it's phrased in terms of critical infrastructure. Information sharing to protect critical infrastructure. It is not limited to that. And none of the bills limit their information sharing provisions to the protection of critical infrastructure. And that's why I think it's a reasonable conclusion that it will be mostly ISPs that will be sharing information because they have a lot of the data that will be sought.
Yeah, and just to jump in one more comment. A lot of the examples you'll hear from the sponsors are, China's trying to hack in and steal our secrets, or maybe there'll be an attack on the electrical grid. These are very serious threats, and we're not opposed to information sharing per se, but they did not write a bill to address those threats. And a bill that were actually targeted at those sorts of things and getting at information that directly bared on those situations would not be that objectionable. But they went much broader, with a much broader definition of cybersecurity that really wraps up a bunch of everyday internet activity. They're sweeping at every bad guy on the internet, which really means they're sweeping at all of us, right? We've all gotten spam email and phishing emails and had our bank account information stolen. I mean, I certainly have through my personal and work email accounts. And now that's part of a Homeland Security event if this bill passes. And that's what we're concerned about, not really the more serious threats that really are, something that the government should be dealing with.
Yeah, in the past, one of the areas of difficulty was disincentive companies to share information. A force-sport situation where there was a breach of service and denial, possibly from hacking, whatever, but they don't want anybody to know that their systems are vulnerable. So does this legislation affect that in any way? If companies only voluntarily share, so one of the big issues seems not to be affected at all. I don't want you to know about my problems. I just don't share, right?
It doesn't require you to share, but it says the incentives that you can't be sued by your private customers, you can't be FOIA for sharing it, it can't be used for a regulatory purpose to get you in trouble. So it takes away some of the things that might scare
I
you.
want you to know that it could be the liability issue, but primarily I don't want you to think that my company is less secure than company A. So I want you to know people are hacking me if that's going to affect me competitively. So I mean, that I know it's been one of the problems in the past, that there were bills to require sharing of breaches to law enforcement without necessarily having to make it broader than that, but it seems like that's still voluntary.
Let me unpack that a little bit. So most states have rules that require disclosure by a company when personally identifiable information is hacked into and disclosed. Okay? About 48 states have that rule. So we're talking about, when it comes to transparency, we're not talking about that because they already have to disclose that. So what the bill says to the companies is you can put restrictions on the further disclosure of this information. You could say, for example, if you're company A, I'm going to disclose this to you, government, but I don't want you to further disclose it. And I think that when it comes to within the government, I'm not sure that they could stop that, but I think actually with the latest amendment, they could stop that within the government. And they could certainly stop the government from disclosing to company C, their competitor. And they could certainly stop the government from making it public. It's already not going to be public under the bill. So I guess the point is that the bill gives the discloser substantial authority to restrict further disclosure of that information. And I think that will encourage some information sharing that would otherwise not occur.
Any other questions?
The way I think that cybersecurity has to work is that most of the disclosures are going to have to be automated. And the IT guy is going to sit down with the lawyer, and they're going to have whatever definition Congress puts in front of them, and they're going to say, okay, what information do we see that we think fits within the definition of what we can disclose? What information do we see that fits within the definition of the relevant personally identifiable information that we can't disclose? Okay? We're going to make a rule set that will operate automatically. It has to be operating automatically, otherwise we won't have the speed with which cybersecurity has to be done. We talked to some of the companies, the guys who are in charge of protecting their networks, they said if the data is a day old, it could be useless to us. If it's a couple hours old, it's a lot less useful than if it was just a few minutes old. It really is that quickly that things have to happen. And the automation, I think, is going to happen with whatever definition is used and with whatever minimization requirements are imposed. There will be some cybersecurity disclosures that require human intervention. And those are going to be slow no matter what the rule is. But we're just going to have to work through that. I think the key is that most of it will be automated and will be according to a rule set that is set in advance.
And Jennifer, one way the other bills dealt with this situation, like the Lieberman bill, the LongTerm bill, the administration's bill, was that they said the companies have to make reasonable efforts to strip out the PII, and they left it at that. So that would be fact-specific, and, you know, it recognizes that in some situations it's not reasonable, and they just need to forward the information without taking the time to strip out the PII. So it would give the flexibility to deal with emergency situations or urgent situations. But then, you know, it would also, you know, theoretically put the burden on them that if they're doing something more long-term, like trying to attribute, you know, a botnet or a phishing scam, that, yeah, you need to take the time to take out the information about the innocent victims. That shouldn't be forwarded or something like that. And so something like that could easily be put into CISPA and make a big privacy difference. You wouldn't have to rewrite the bill or change the format or anything, but it would make, you know, a huge difference for privacy and the amount of information that would be getting into government hands.
And it also says in the Lieberman language, reasonable efforts to remove the PII that's about specific persons unrelated to the cybersecurity threat. So when you're setting up those rules, like Greg was talking about, it's something you can carve out. Sometimes there will be PII that is going to be an integral component of it, and that's recognized. In the back.
Yeah, Andrew with Congressman Nadler's office. Greg, you mentioned state rules. I know there's preemption language. How does that preemption language work with those state rules or other state protections for civil liberties that may exist?
Thompson. It's notwithstanding any law, including state laws. So if a state law says a company can't disclose, it can. If the state law says the information that goes to the state government is available under the state sunshine law, that too is preempted. So that's kind of a theme in the bill, that cybersecurity purpose will trump all purposes.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you for joining us. If you join me in thanking our panelists.